Well, I'm here with Tim Shoveller, CEO of Freightliner. Tim, it's great to be here. Thanks for your time. I wonder if we can just start with your background. I mean, you've had an extraordinary career in the railways. What inspired you to get interested in railways in the first place?
Do you know, I've spent a long time trying to work that out, and I've concluded it's my mum. She's always been a bit interested in trains. There was a railway very close to where we used to live, which I guess I was interested in watching those trains, and it just sort of went from there. So I used to go train spotting when I was a kid and what have you. But at the age of 15, I joined the Midlands Railway, which I think you've been to recently, as a volunteer. I was a junior porter at Alton Station, and that professionalised, if you like, what had become a sort of a teenage enthusiasm. It really went from there.
And it went from there?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So what was your first role then on the, I suppose, if I say the railway proper, it's no disrespect to the Midlands because it's a superb operation, but you know, on the National Rail, what was the first role then?
So I was called a trainman, trainman D, which was essentially a guard who was in the line of promotion to be a train driver, as opposed to a train person G who was going to be a day guard. And because I'd gone to university, I went to university for 3 days, and after 3 days, I just thought, I don't want to spend any more time in the classroom. By that point, I was shunting, I was signalling, I was, competent in many railway skills, which I loved, and I still love doing now. So I just thought, I've had enough of the academic side. I want to get into practice. So I rang up BR and said, look, I'm not going to finish the graduate management. I can't join as a graduate manager, which had been sort of the plan. And they said, well, you have to join right at the bottom, join as a guard. So I applied and joined as a trainman.
It's quite a big thing, actually, to sort of move from a graduate scheme to that. But I mean, you know, fair play. And I'm going to guess you're going to say never looked back.
Yeah, no, I didn't. And I'm very glad I did, because actually, if I'd finished my degree, by the time I'd have finished the degree, BR would have gone.
It's amazing.
So actually, it worked out really, really well for me.
Serendipity. There we go. So first time we met, I think we were at Wessex.
Yeah.
And then you had a number of sort of key roles. I mean, just walk us through those briefly, because I know you really have had such a broad operational experience. It's quite impressive.
Thank you. Someone said I was a railway tart because I'd moved around so much. I think it's my own management development scheme, in all seriousness. So I went from to the station at Guildford, a station supervisor. That was a scandal because I was 19 years old. No 19-year-old was supposed to get a supervisor's job in those days. But I did, and then of course privatisation was announced, and that was a huge, oh my goodness, you know, this thing I've been wanting to do all my life, suddenly, what's it going to be? Eurostar was opening up, so in '93 I went to Eurostar at Waterloo, and that was, again, a lucky break for me. Didn't really enjoy it very much, actually, because the culture was all over the place, of a mix of Euro Disney, airline and railway. It was a bit crazy, but I learned so much about working with people and with foreign railways, SNCF, SNCB particularly. It was through then that I went to go to Silverlink, North London Railways as it was, and as so often then happens through my career, you work with someone and then you work with them again.
Yeah.
Charles Belcher was MD of Silverlink. He, several years later, ended up working for him again when he was MD of Wessex. That's when we first met.
Absolutely.
That introduced me to National Express. That introduced me to Midland Main Line then with David Franks, when Midland Main Line was in some significant distress, I think, during Project Rio, with, I think, 67% PPM, I seem to recall, on the Monday that I was literally sent to Derby by National Express to get there and fix the operation, with David as an overhaul of the company. Back with Charles Belcher again at Virgin, West Coast, where I spent a couple of years working for Stuart Baker, Simon Pilkington, who both of whom, you know, we talked about in the programme extensively. And I did the Virgin side of what became VHF, which is fabulous. Left before that was implemented, though, because we planned it all in 2004. Left when Stagecoach, who were the partner of Virgin, asked me if I'd like to go and be managing director of their new East Midlands Trains franchise.
I mean, that's a massive thing. I mean, South West Trains, biggest franchise?
That was East Midlands Trains.
Oh, right. Sorry.
South West
Right.
Trains comes later.
Ah, sorry.
So that was
Okay.
East Midlands Trains in 2007,
Right.
which had just been won by Stagecoach,
Yeah.
taken over and merged Central Trains and Middle and Main Line, which obviously previously had
Yes, I was sore about that at the time, of course, because I was at National Express, but never
You
mind.
probably were, that's right. But we won't bring out the Wessex thing either, because there's.
Oh, no, well, that's fair. Okay. Moving swiftly on. Yeah.
So so that was wonderful. That was my first MD's job. On a railway I knew well, working with Stagecoach, which I absolutely loved, the culture of Stagecoach. Did that for several years, got responsibility for the trams. And then, of course, Sir David Higgins and Sir Ryan Suter decided it would be great to try and demonstrate the benefits of an integrated railway. And that's when they asked if I would go to South West Trains and Network Rail to run the Alliance, as it was called. So for 3 years, from 2012, I was MD of South West Trains and I was route director for Network Rail at the same time. Putting that together was an incredible challenge because everyone said it's impossible. You can't have one person that's in charge of both. And like so many things on the railway, it's not true. You can't have one legal entity that's responsible for both. There's nothing in law to say you can't have two jobs. So in a sense, that's what I did. I had a job for Network Rail and a job for Stagecoach. And then with my team, we had about probably 20 people at the end of the day who had joint responsibilities for Network Rail and South West Trains.
It's amazing. I mean, we've both, one of the many things we've got in common, we've both survived working with Graham Eccles. But no, he was just absolutely superb. But one of the things that Graham's very proud of is that integrated, I mean, that was vertically integrated railway in a way, wasn't it? I mean, how far away were we really from that, what you described as South West Trains and Network Rail and vertical integration?
Well, I think in the first round of what Graham did, that was about joining the control up.
Yeah.
And that was the big success of, albeit there was still there was a single control manager, but that control manager had two line managers, which made it quite difficult for that person. What we did when we started the full integrated alliance in 2012 was go a big quantum step forward where we brought all of the operations in scope to that, not just the control, but the whole thing. So, for example, Mark Stewart, as an operations director, he was responsible for both signallers and drivers.
Right.
That was, pretty radical, and electrical control operators. So that meant that Mark had responsibility for the entire operational piece, for example. Sam, who was the commercial director, had responsibility for Network Rail's commercial issues and also the top commercial issues. So that was a big challenge, a big change. And for 3 years, it was, I think, hugely successful. People say, was the alliance successful? I say, well, if you look at the fact that we reopened Waterloo International, which until that point had been a theatre, in the busiest railway station in the country, that was trying to turn trains around in 7 minutes because there were too few platforms, and yet there was a spare station next door. So yes, I think the alliance achieved lots of things. It achieved some real very notable things like Waterloo, like the 10-car scheme, which would have happened, but happened faster. New trains, the 707s, they weren't going to happen. But really, actually, what it did was bring people together. So to your question about how close did we get to having a fully integrated railway, say we had 20 odd people in the business who had joint responsibility. That's not been replicated.
It's kind of all you need, though, at that sort of senior leadership level.
I think you also interviewed Andrew Pennington. He was one of them. So Andrew had responsibility for the network rail planning in Wessex Route, and he was also the South West Trains train planning manager.
So why did it stop?
Together? Well, because the shareholders basically were compromised. Despite huge efforts from Robin, who was one of the shareholders from Network Rail, and Martin from Stagecoach, the entities, of course, had completely different objectives. It was set up by David Higgins. He moved on, so the sponsor, if you like, had changed, and of course that was all in CP4. CP5, the South West Trains franchise was coming to an end, and was very close to ending at that point, and CP5 gave Network Rail a challenge, which I remember seeing Mark one day with his head in his hands, that around Christmas time of that year was estimated at £7 billion. There was no way that South West Trains could continue being on a 50% risk share with Network Rail when the CP5 budget was so obviously broken. And of course, it subsequently collapsed, the CP5 plan, and was restructured. And of course, now Lord Peter Hendy came in and picked up Network Rail and rejuvenated it.
Right.
But of course, had to take a lot of stuff out of CP5 that was expected to do. The principle of the alliance had not just been about working together, it was financially risk sharing as well.
Yeah.
And there was no way that Stagecoach could take risk on Network Rail, inevitable losses.
Yeah.
That was impossible. So that's why I had to split.
Well, we've kind of been there before, of course, at Virgin Pub 2, but that's kind of another story, isn't it?
Same principle, yeah.
Same principle. So then you did one of two things that surprised me. The first thing you did surprise me, you moved to Network Rail, and the reason that was a surprise was, for me, you were always like the operator's operator. You were out there, frontline, getting those trains. I'll never forget the thunder of whistles on the Middle and Main Line. And now you'd gone to this massive organisation, and there was a fear. You just kind of, oh, gee, what's Tim gone to do there? Why Network Rail? What was the attraction of that role?
Well, Andrew Haynes, Peter Hendy, definitely, without a shadow of a doubt. I went to work for Andrew because I have a huge respect for both of them, and Andrew was just probably 9 months into his role as chief executive then, with a huge ambitious agenda of decentralisation and of bringing operations back into Network Rail. All of which are things which I'm enormously passionate about. It helped because Stagecoach and Virgin had decided they were going to come out of rail.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I thought, what do I want to do with the rest of my career? But if Andrew hadn't been at Network Rail, I probably wouldn't have joined. The fact that I had the Wessex experience for 3 years meant that I think I was able to cope. I think I'd have had that my body would have rejected Network Rail's culture had I not had the Wessex experience that helped me understand what I was going to go into.
Presumably the alliance experience at South West Trains. I mean,
exactly
I suppose it's fair. You kind of knew what you were getting.
What I was going to get myself into, and therefore I could adjust and recognise that. But that was really important because otherwise, as a train operator, I think I'd have had tissue rejection. I would have struggled. And that's not saying Network Rail's bad. Don't get me wrong. It's just that it's so completely different from the private sector world, and to bring those 2 points together, what one party would consider as good and acceptable is different to the other. I can't illustrate how much and emphasise how important that is because that's the challenge that another 40,000 people are going to go through for the next 3 years.
I know. No, it's fair. We will come on to that, I'm sure, because that's a crucial point. Network Rail, you did some amazing stuff around industrial relations and managing that process, which must have been pretty tough. But then you did the second thing that I thought was a big surprise, because I had you down as a logical future chief executive of Network Rail. You left and went to Freightliner, and we'll talk about Freightliner in a minute. But that was a surprise. Well, it felt very sudden.
Yes, and I felt very bad about it because I felt like I was letting Andrew down. I said that to him. So it was something I didn't do lightly. I did it because I was frustrated. Not with Andrew, not with Network Rail. I was frustrated with where the industry was at. I had, that's 10 years after the alliance, and I could see the railway was going backwards in many ways, and in ways that I found completely unacceptable. And despite having huge energy and determination, I wasn't able to persuade those around me that we needed to move now rather than wait for legislation. And when I say those around me, I don't mean Network Rail, because Network Rail was up for it. I mean the operating companies that I was working with.
That's interesting. Okay.
I wanted to fix the problems that we had today. Now, some we did. We did manage to sort the timetables out. When I joined Network Rail with this crazy timetable that had a train that ran as part of the West Midlands bid from Liverpool to Euston via Birmingham with a few minute turnaround at Euston because it was allowed. But it was crazy. It never ran on time. It had 4 crew changes. That was the worst of train planning and the worst of franchise bidding. So we got rid of that sort of stuff. and we put a resilient timetable in. And the West Midlands timetable today is a credit to them and recovers much better when things go wrong. But there were so many other things like that that we needed to do that we couldn't do. So I was frustrated, and I was starting to not enjoy the job that I loved. I was starting to be frustrated with the railway industry, and I thought I have to do something because I won't be at my best. I can't be enthusiastic and motivated and lead a team of we had 8,500 people. I can't do that well if I'm not at my best, and I know I'm not going to be at my best.
Yeah.
Having dealt with government and seen what Network Rail had to do to go through government to get agreement to do the pay award, illustrated to me just how crazy this whole situation is now, where the railway can't make sensible decisions the railway should.
Right.
I understand why, because of the huge funding that the Department for Transport was putting into the railway. I've got John Smith to thank, actually, in many respects. My son Archie, he's 20. He had started working for GB as ground staff, and he was having a lovely time. He was coming home telling me about all the things that he was doing every day. I was like, oh wow, that's what I was loving when I started joining the railway. I've known John for a long time, and we used to go out and do cab rides and what have you. And I thought, actually, you've got a great job.
Yeah.
And then Freightliner came up, and I was like, absolutely, what a wonderful opportunity.
Fantastic. So, and that was the reason, was it? Because I mean, again, Freightliner, you did not had a sort of a freight background before. I wondered whether Freightliner was. I kind of fancy that sector now, or was it serendipity? It was just the right job at the right time and in a way, it just happened to be at Freightliner.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I think the fit was important.
Right.
So the thing I loved about Freightliner was, yes, it allowed me to stay in rail and use my knowledge and the skills and the thing that I love doing, but also to do that in a way that was a different sector.
Yeah.
And I was learning again. I love learning. So that ticked that box. The fact that it was a sister to Genesee and Wyoming in the US, that immediately sort of floated my boat, because of course that's a really serious freight railway.
Yeah.
And of course it's owned by private equity, so which means that there is this real focus on getting stuff done today, not tomorrow,
Right.
for today. And that's my way of doing business.
Yeah. No, that's always been you. So I completely get that. What did you find when you got here, though? I mean, and have you found that? Did you come in with a vision, a plan, or did you sort of come in and go, right, I just need to understand it first, and then I'll devise the plan?
Yeah, certainly more the latter. I think it's really important to understand as the leader of a business, leader of an organisation, safety critical, thousands of people.
Yeah.
I think the worst thing is if someone arrives and starts making decisions without really understanding the consequence of their decisions.
Yeah.
So I wanted to learn about the business, and I was able to do some of that before I actually started. In the handover period, I started researching. I met the team. But then, yes, when I started, I wanted to really quite quickly get around the business. So I went around the business at a rate of knots and met as many people as I could at all of the locations that we have, including our businesses in Europe and the bits that I'm less familiar with. Like, we've got 200 trucks. So I wanted to understand more and more about that and absorb all of that. There was a strategic plan in place, which the shareholders were pretty keen to make sure that we, didn't throw that out, maybe with bathwater, because there were some good elements to it. So we built that. What I found was amazing people, as is so often the case with the railway, amazing people. And, there is a real fantastic culture in freight, because everyone knows unless we deliver the train with the customer's goods on, essentially, we'll be out of a job tomorrow, because there's a road fleet out there that will take our work from us as quick as we fail. So actually, in a way that I don't see anymore, and I say anymore, in the UK railway larger, in passenger railway, there is absolute determination to make sure the train must run safely, but it must run. And we'll find a way of running it safely rather than saying, oh, it's not safe, we can't do it. It is unacceptable just to say, oh, we can't do it. Yeah. Ultimately, of course, we will never, if there is no way of doing it safely and we've explored the other option, okay, occasionally we won't run a train. But it's very occasional, and it's after we know that every opportunity to do it safely has been explored. Yeah. And I think that threshold has changed fundamentally over my career. I'm sure some of our PR operators of old would be spinning literally in their graves because sometimes we just give up too easily.
Yeah.
And I recognise how crucial this thing about safety culture is. We've just had the 25th anniversary of Ladbroke Grove, haven't we? And one of so many accidents that's left a huge imprint on all of us. So nothing that I say, I would ever intend to give licence to being reckless, but I believe in being professional, and professionals manage risk rather than just avoiding it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's in the rail industry. We have to manage risk. The very nature of what we do means that it's inherent, and we do that through having great people and systems.
Okay, so let's talk now just about rail freight generally. So we're at 30,000 feet. We're looking down on this sector. How do you sort of sum up the position that rail freight finds itself in 2024? In sort of general terms.
Yeah. Well, it's got some amazing things going for it, hasn't it? Has there ever been a time when the ability to move goods in a low carbon way has been more valuable, than the existential crisis that presents us in the future of the world?
Yeah.
So, 76% less carbon emitted per tonne if it goes by train than goes by lorry. That's a diesel train. If it goes by electric locomotive, 95%.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that is one of the most important aspects that rail freight has. And of course, there's less air pollution, and the capacity that rail has to move goods efficiently. All of those things, with the congested streets and congested roads, all of those things say to me that rail is absolutely the right place to be. And I can talk to my investors at Brookfield and talk to them confidently about why rail is a good bet for the medium term. The downside is that for the last 14 years, roads has been getting cheaper and rail's been getting more expensive. We've seen a divergence with road fuel duty, which is one of the biggest variable costs that road companies see. It's been fixed for 14 years. It hasn't even increased with inflation. So road fuel duty has gone down in real terms, whilst track access fees, which are the biggest variable that we have gone up by about 150%. So we've had reverse modal shift. So at a time when the country and the environment needs stuff going by rail, we've actually incentivized road to be cheaper than rail. That's clearly mad. It doesn't make sense at any level. And you can tell that because one of our biggest competitors, a company called Maritime, set up by a really impressive guy called John Williams, I've got to know quite well. He's a haulier. He's a truck haulier. I think he's got about 1,800 trucks, but he now charters, I think, about 10 trains a day. And he's moving stuff by rail because it's the right thing to do from an environmental perspective. But, he is the first one to call out the crazy way that the economics of the railway are.
Let's explore that in a bit of detail, because the excellent Roger Ford has recently done some typically Roger Ford analysis looking at the decision of Royal Mail to stop using their Class 325 EMU and move to road, right? And there was a lot of stuff about, sort of environmental stuff. But when you look at the numbers, Roger's come up with this wonderful parameter of roll cage, cost per roll cage kilometre, which is actually very sensible because, of course, a Class 325 takes more cages than a truck, so you've got to do that. And I was stunned by two things. Number one, that actually EC for T compared to diesel, bizarrely, the spot price for EC for T is not that different per roll cage kilometre than the diesel. Where rail gets absolutely hammered is on the variable usage charge. Right. So you look at the cost of variable usage track access charges for train compared to vehicle excise duty for a 44-ton HGV, and it's like a factor of 10. How on earth is rail expect? I mean, who's let that happen? Well, it's clearly not the freight operator.
No, absolutely.
How has that been allowed to happen?
Absolutely. And so there's been a policy that rail regulators had for a number of years of trying to make sure that rail freight covers its full costs as allocated through the track access charging model. So the reason that track access charges have increased, I think, is twofold. One, Network Rail's costs have gone up and gone up quite significantly over 10 years. And the proportion, whereas 10 years ago rail freight was are we not paying its full costs of the variable usage charge, the intention of the regulator is that it does now. So there's been two compounding impacts. The total costs have gone up, and on top of that, rail is now bearing its full.
And then that is enshrined in legislation, isn't it? So, or is it? I mean,
well,
it seems to me like it's a case of don't trouble me with common sense because my model says this.
There's been a lot of debate with ORR, and I think it's my words. I was at a presentation with John Larkinson a few weeks ago. I think ORR now recognised that the situation has become a bit crazy because the total amount of variable usage charge that freight operators pay to Network Rail is tiny. It's 0.5% of Network Rail's total income, right? It makes no difference. It's a couple of million. It's millions.
Makes quite a lot of difference to you, though.
It makes all the difference to us, and it makes enough difference for our customers that that they will stop using rail.
Yeah.
So because they are not committed to rail, their supply chains work equally well without rail. So rail is a nice thing to do for many of them. It's not a prerequisite to.
And since the value of carbon saved doesn't hit the P&L, right? That Royal Mail decision was about money.
Yeah,
and you can't blame them for that.
No,
because they have got shareholders as well.
Yeah, it's not their job to subsidise a.
But you being you have got a plan. So you've come up with this track access credit, which seeks to at least address this in part from a stimulus point of view. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so two things happened at once. First, this very significant cost problem for rail freight was very evident to me. Secondly, of course, this whole East Coast Main Line debate about the new timetable for East Coast Main Line, which was terrifying. I was when I was chair of Virgin Trains East Coast, and we were trying to introduce that same timetable in I think 2020. But hasn't yet been introduced. So, and the reason that's significant is because that was rapidly turning into a win for passenger and lose for freight. The way that was being characterised was this, the only way to run all the passenger trains, because all the infrastructure wasn't built, is to sacrifice rail, both existing freight trains today, and certainly any hope of growth.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's completely unacceptable, isn't it? Going back to my point about carbon,
in every sense.
Right. So the debate was focused around this, what was very rapidly becoming a win-lose. So my approach was to say, no, we have to have win-wins. That is how I've always worked. I believe in collaboration. I believe in win-wins. And the answer to that, of course, is you use electric haulage, because electric haulage, as we know, allows trains to accelerate much faster. Electric trains are much more reliable, so they break down less. And of course, they maintain a higher average speed. But even though the variable, the EC4T spot cost is the same as diesel, we know that electricity spikes rapidly, and next month it could be twice the cost of diesel. So the way the system is structured at the moment is incentivizing, in fact, requiring freight operators to use diesel. Can't afford to use electricity, certainly not to buy an expensive new engine, because if the price of electricity spikes, I can't use it. And many operators have stood down all of their electric fleets for that reason. And we did for a while. I'll tell you how we got it ours back. But clearly, between these two challenges of a cost base that's too high and an East Coast Main Line that's being squeezed, and an inevitability that's what happens on West Coast already, but what happens much worse as a result of HS2. I needed to change the dynamic into how do we create a win-win. Yeah. I can see what they've done in Germany, where for example, they say that the cost of electricity for traction won't be more than diesel. They float up and down together. That's clever. They do it in Germany under the same broadly legislative system that we use. Okay, that's interesting. Why can't we do that? And what that led to was Network Rail brilliantly reintroducing a track access reduction scheme for new flows, because Network Rail could do that right now. They did it within 6 months, and we started our first train a couple of weeks ago using that discount. Now that just gives you time to launch a train and grow the volume to the point where it breaks even. That's problem number one. Now we come back to problem number two, the much more significant issue around the medium and long-term costs. So my argument is that when a freight train is hauled by an electric locomotive, you've heard the arguments, The benefits of that, though, that faster acceleration, the reliability, the higher top end speed, the benefits don't help freight.
Help everybody.
They help everybody else. Yeah?
Exactly.
So the irony is that by using an electric locomotive on a freight train, the passenger trains have a better journey, and ultimately you can run more of them, and you learn, and therefore as an industry, GBR can earn more revenue from them. So, I don't know how much now the new service on the East Coast is worth, all those additional trains that will be run, but it will be tens of millions, 20, 30, 40, 50 a year, I should imagine, quite easily. Well, I think a fraction of that should be reinvested to allow the use of electric locomotives on freight trains. That then creates a win-win. The freight trains get out of the way faster, and we can run the passenger trains, which gives the better revenue. So you close the circle. It's the fundamental thing that having GBR allows the industry to do in terms of having a whole system profit and loss account. I can see that I can earn a huge amount of money over here on passenger revenue, but in order to enable that, I need to provide a bit of an incentive for freight operators to use electric trains rather than diesel. That seems like a no-brainer to me. Of course, there's complications to it. We currently use electric locomotives on our trains, but because there's so little of the UK network that's electrified, we have to swap them on and swap them off, like changing horses in Victorian times. Well, every time we do that, it costs basically an hour, and it costs additional drivers, and of course the deployment of those locomotives is now inefficient, isn't it? When we run a train from Felixstowe towards Ipswich, it has a Class 66. When it gets to Ipswich, it goes into the loop, into the sidings, the 66 comes off with one driver, the 90s, plus 90s, which have been sitting there waiting for it with another driver, then they go on, which the shunter then couples up, and we repeat a brake test. And about half an hour to an hour later, the train will then carry on its journey. If you use a bi-mode locomotive, of course, you swing off the curve at Ipswich, put the pan up, and you go. And in the context of East Coast that I was just talking about, it's incredible to think that you'd be swapping locos, at Peterborough or various other locations. It's just uneconomic. So because of the lack of the country's bi-mode, the country's electricity supply throughout the network, the only way to use electric traction on freight really is to use bi-mode locomotives. So bi-mode locomotives are the answer for the UK to allow the wider use of electric traction for freight, but they're really expensive. I mean, we're talking 2 to 3 times the cost of an existing Class 66, okay? And we've already established the fact that I can't charge the customer anymore for the fact it's a sexy bi-mode loco than a diesel. The customer's not willing to pay because we're already more expensive than road. So how do we bridge that gap when the benefit goes to the wider industry, goes to passengers? So the idea is to extend this scheme that we've developed with Network Rail around track access for those 6 months and think, well, what if we push that much, much further? How do we create the whole P&L profit and loss capability for the UK Rail around this solution? And the answer, I think, is to recognise that when the electric locomotive is being used, that there's a system which would discount, frankly, the cost of the track access, which I think I've established is already pretty significant, discount that cost if the freight operator is using an electric locomotive. And the benefit for that is paid for by the better passenger service that's delivered, both in the revenue, but also in the reliability. As that electric locomotives are much more reliable than diesel. And to illustrate this, when we today use our Class 90s to haul a train on the West Coast Main Line, that will haul an 1,800-ton intermodal train over Shap and Beatuk, the steepest parts of the route. It will go over the top at 75 miles an hour. Right? If we use a Class 66, it goes over at 24 miles an hour. I remember standing in the signal box at Carlisle, and watching Pendolino leave, and the following freight train leave, and then the following Pendolino chasing it down before the top of the hill, and it is terrifying because, of course, it's a true track railway. There's a few bit of loops, but most of the loops are too short for the freight trains. And it was bonkers. In fact, one of the ideas I had at that time when we were doing the VHF timetable was surely the right thing to do is to have electric locomotives stationed at Preston and Carlisle that Network Rail might have paid for to haul,
Just get them out of the way.
Get out of the way.
I know.
That never came to fruition, but
No.
the concept was there. And East Coast, the thing that we can be really clear about is that the most valuable thing that we've got in UK rail is capacity. And how we use that capacity, wisely or poorly, will determine whether we need to build more railway or whether we can go further with the railway we've already got. And this is a really classic example of that. Of course, in some cases, it's right to expand the amount of fixed infrastructure, but we know how expensive that is and we know how long it takes. So we do need to do that. But before we do that, or whilst we're doing that, we should always squeeze out every bit of capacity that we can possibly get from the existing network. And the electrification of freight is one way that would significantly enhance that. So my argument is the track extra credits, a discount, should allow for the operator to be recompensed.
That's beautifully linked to another question of capacity. HS2, West Coast Main Line, Trent Valley in particular, but not just Trent Valley, because there's other places that we all know about, Weaver and then north of Preston that we've just talked about actually. I always felt that Phase 2A in particular was as much a benefit for freight capacity as it was for anything else. It helped the whole system. It was hugely important for freight. When that decision was announced to cancel it, your heart must have sunk because, yet again, freight got stuffed, surely.
Yeah, yes, in terms of the frustration. If I'd been with Network Rail at that point, I probably would have lost my job because I'd have said something because I don't think. It was just so crass decision. It's just unspeakable. So, and my heart goes out to everyone that it's just genuinely disappointing, isn't it? And it's so good that Andy Burnham and now the Mayor of West Midlands are trying to find a way of rejuvenating it. Great, 100% support from my perspective. And I think the railway's got a problem. I don't, you highlight that there's a freight risk to it. Yes, there is, but I also think electrification of freight would mitigate some of that.
Yeah.
Actually, how many fewer passenger trains are going to have to run?
Yeah.
The railway's got a problem. And particularly if the connection at Handsacre, as it was going to be, continues to be a slow line connection at Handsacre. The fast line connection was discounted several years ago because that had an enormous cost. Now I've lost track of where Network Rail colleagues have got to with answering that question now. But yeah, it's horrendous. But the electrification point still wins.
Yeah.
And B, some great work by Chris Gibb that you talked about, and the work that the mayors are doing. To my mind, it's inevitable that there will be additional capacity built between Handsacre and Crewe.
Yeah.
I don't care what it's called. I really don't care whether it runs at 200, 250 miles now. I worked for Eurostar for 4 or 5 years, and I have to say that the French system, to my mind, is amazing. So copy that, as HS1 did. So I'm all up for that, and I think we have to work really hard to find a way of it not getting in the way of the growth of freight that is essential for the country's economy and our environment.
Yeah, no, listen, I think everybody would endorse that completely. Are you finding though that when you talk to your customers who aren't really interested in the problems of the railway, they're just interested in outcomes in terms of reliability and cost in terms of what the invoice is going to say. Do things like the well-publicised issues of HS2 and capacity constraints on the West Coast or capacity constraints elsewhere, does that sort of put customers off, or are they just looking for you to find solutions?
No, completely. And strikes.
Of course.
Damage. So yes, no, it does put them off. And what I find is talking to potential freight customers is that it's very much like passengers. There's many similarities. Those people that use the railway, freight customers and passengers, tend to know that actually, yeah, there's a bad days, but overall, it works very well.
Yeah.
Those that don't use the railway, passengers and freight customers, have a perception of rail which is much worse than the reality. And because they've heard that they see a lack of government confidence in rail, HS2. They see a potential disruption, weather. They see disruption in terms of the risk of strikes. And you can imagine that if you are responsible for the logistics chain, whether it be a supermarket or an aggregates company, would you put your neck on the block to say that, come on, we should use rail, or we should use more rail in that environment?
It's a big call, isn't it?
It's a huge call, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I met with the MD of one of the UK's biggest quarrying companies a couple of weeks ago, and I was really grateful for his time. And it was a really good discussion, and achieved
A sense of book coming.
Yeah, because he's a big rail customer, huge rail customer, yeah. But I said to him, what percentage of everything that you do is rail? He said about 20 to 30%. And he's one of the country's biggest rail customers.
One of the best products to move by rail. Yeah.
And he said about 20 to 30%. And I said, well, how do we grow that? And of course, then you get into but to connect a new freight sidings are going to cost £1 squillion and take 30 years, isn't it? Which is the perception that everyone has. Yeah. And sadly, sometimes right. Yeah. Sometimes it is very difficult and it is very expensive. That's not a slight at rail. I've been on that side. So, and then is there a path? And is that path guaranteed? Is that path going to be there? And it's not good enough. And this is one of my challenges with GBR. It's not good enough just to say, well, yes, there will be a path there at 2200 and you can come out at 4 o'clock in the morning. Because if the customer needs the stone during the day, you've got to find a path during the day. Yeah. And the idea of having assets that are very inefficiently used because of the fact that there's only, off-peak paths is a problem. Yeah. It goes back to this cost thing, doesn't it? If I don't use my assets well and sweat them, then someone's got to pay for it. Yeah. And every time a train goes into a freight loop, or it's given a timing which means that it's uneconomic, well, it's inefficient, it becomes uneconomic. Yeah. So having the confidence to know that the train path is available, within reason at the time it's needed, is essential to the economics of rail freight. Yeah. Just, so would you invest several £1 million of your own money if you think there's a risk that you're only going to get paths when it suits the railway industry, not when it suits you? You're not.
No, and there's the key. No, absolutely. Well, that kind of takes us neatly on to the brave new world, the bright new future of Great British Railways. I just wanted to very quickly quote a couple of things that Louise Haigh said in her April 2024 Get Britain Moving policy, which was kind of Labour's "this is what we're going to do," at a point at which when we didn't know there was going to be an election as quickly as there was. She said, an incoming Labour government will establish a new arm's-length public body, GBR, a directing mind in charge of Britain's railway infrastructure and services, responsible for the day-to-day operational delivery of the railways and ensuring infrastructure services work together, and for innovations and improvements in the experience of passengers and freight users. Well, that was a good bit because freight didn't get forgotten. Terrific. Yep. Then she went on to say, this new structure will end the meddling and interference on operational and industrial relation matters by ministers in Whitehall that has created such confusion and paralysis. Would you, I suppose I've got a few questions on that. Would you sort of say, yep, I broadly agree with that, but I suppose particularly given that GBR-TT, the sort of the transition team, were working, admittedly to a different political agenda, but on a different path, a more guiding mind, a more softer touch. This is very much directing mind. What was your sort of reaction when you read that?
I was excited to read it. Yeah. And it was great that there was ambition being shown, because that really matters to us. And going back to some of those freight customers, that's what matters to them as well. Do they believe the government is ambitious to move stuff from road to rail, and if they are, then you've got the doors open for conversation. So I was really excited to read that. No, it was very positive, and I have a I can debate this with you because I know you. So there's this directing mind thing, and I've heard Andrew talk about this both on your podcast but also previously. I've got a different word that I use, which is leading. So, and it's not to play a game with it. It's just to think that actually throughout my career, I think we need a leading body and a leading mind. But that leading obviously then implies the ability to make sure that it does have the ability to implement what it needs at the end of the day.
No, I like that. I think I think that's very
It's
good.
a subtle nuance,
Yeah.
but I think it's quite an important one, recognising the
Yeah.
world that we live in and the way the railway is structured.
Yeah.
And hopefully that gets a better outcome. So, but I was also delighted and excited to see Lord Peter been appointed as rail minister. So it's not what was described, but I do see there's a sort of a, having Lord Peter in the department, having Alex there with him, having Andrew at Rail, having Robin running the trains, and obviously now with the appointment of Laura Schoaf last week as the chair of Shadow GBR, that's all good for me. I'm encouraged by that.
So I was going to ask you that because I like the leading part. I think that's very good because sometimes leaders have to be quite are very much behind the scenes, just cajoling, and sometimes leaders come out and say, right, we're going to do this, right? And it's kind of horses for courses, isn't it? So no, I get that, and I think that's really good. But interesting what you just said there about you're encouraged by what's happened since, because some would say, I might well be one of them, that a lot of the language from that same document, which was, ministers will step back, Whitehall will step back, and there was an immediacy and pace about it. 100 days on, maybe that's not long enough. It doesn't feel as if that same energy is there in reality as we thought might be there in that document.
Peter Henry as well as I do. I saw him a couple of weeks ago. There's a bundle of energy there, and a great wisdom. To not, it sounds terribly, but I only say that because of the respect I have. And you've got some really impressive individuals there. I don't think the UK railway is capable of standing on its own 2 feet right now, sadly. I think that the 30 odd years we've had since privatisation has weakened and diluted some of the knowledge and the expertise that's needed, to the extent that if government were just to say, right, there you go, get on with it, I think that would be quite risky. I like emotionally, I like the idea of it. I think if I put my CEO hat on, I think to myself, blimey, there's a ton of problems here which we need to sort out first. And I think, bizarrely, one of the things when I think back to the white paper, the blue paper in '92, and then the white paper that followed it, what that did was set out a roadmap, which wasn't particularly clear, but it set out what the principles were going to be of the new organisation. And then very quickly, BR brought that to life and operationalised it so that by the time we got to '94, people could start implementing it. Today, going back to this point about private sector and public sector and people crashing into each other, when I remember the emotion that we had in the Alliance 10 years ago when we were asking Network Rail and South West Trains people to work together, unguided, without a plan, without clarity, I think we would take would be at significant risk of things going wrong. And I think before we have that distance, which I absolutely think is essential, we have to make sure that we're match fit to play.
That's fair. Let me challenge you a little bit though, because I'm not talking about a distance on absolutely everything, because I think there are a number of issues. I mean, fares is a good example because it's quite political and it's quite complex, and that does need careful thought. But things like delivering, if I can call it this, a safe, boring, predictable, reliable railway, resilient timetables, assets in the right place, train operators and planners doing what they do well, with the greatest of respect to the Department for Transport. And this is not trying to be clever or anything.
No.
That's not what they do, right? That's what we do. That's what railway operators do. So we do have some terrific leaders. It's that sort of day-to-day micromanagement of operational issues, which I wonder whether that is something where the industry, a bit like you said earlier when you were talking about why you got frustrated with Network Rail, that, you know, the industry just not going, let's just do this. It's that bit that I wonder whether we could start to make a difference very quickly.
So, look, going back to the whistles and the use of the
always comes back to whistles.
Always comes back to the whistles. I get that completely because as a you know, inherently I'm an operator.
Yeah.
So the idea of making a difference today is really important to me. But I think we have to set out for those people, what are the rules?
Yeah.
In this new world, where can they go? Where can they not go? What is acceptable in that effort to improve performance today? How do we make sure that freight doesn't get trampled on whilst that's being done? Because that would be really easy to accidentally damage freight whilst those changes would, you know. So in terms of fixing it today, does that mean that if a train company and Network Rail are working together, they're going to discard the current rules around train regulation and just going to fix the train regulation problem? And then where does freight fit into that? What about, you know, what about the train from Wales? Who's making these decisions? The problem is we've built up this incredible, I don't think helpful, but we've built this incredible structure of contracts and rules and guidance and expectation around how we run the railway. And whilst I emotionally love the idea of a person sitting on top of that saying, right, let's make this really easy. I'll show you what the right thing to do is, right? In practice, I don't think you can get there overnight. I think that needs structure and it needs education and training. We're going to have to train people to know how to apply and how to work in the new world. It doesn't need to take long. This isn't something that I'm saying is going to take, you know, it isn't a generational thing, but we do have to be clear what's going to change before we change it. Otherwise, we risk actually we risk accidentally creating chaos in a system that's already, I think, quite fragile.
That's fair. I suppose, if I say it's my frustration, but just my side concern, that hearing you talk about taking time to get it right, I know comes dripping with the pace and energy and enthusiasm and drive that we need.
Yes.
Whereas perhaps some others, it needs to take time, would not necessarily come with all of those things. So I'd like your version of...
And let me give you a little example. So just think about insurance. So at the moment, a train company will have insurance and the rolling stock it uses will be insured as part of that insurance the train company has. And Network Rail has insurance and what have you. When we did the alliance, one of the reasons why we didn't make as much progress in the first 6 months as I hoped was because we had to sort the insurance out. Because if I've got one person, let's say you, Richard, are now going to be the control manager today, and you're going to make a decision on behalf of South West Trains, okay? But you work for Network Rail. Does the South West Trains, and there's an accident, does the South West Trains insurance broker go, yeah, but we're not paying out because that decision was made by a Network Rail person. You're not an employee of South West Trains. You've got no locus to make that decision. I'm not going to pay. Now, we couldn't be in that position, and not least because it invalidates your franchise agreement and all the rolling stock leases. So we had to get all the insurers to agree that actually, if a decision was made, by a competent individual, irrespective of who they worked for, that was legitimate should there then be an accident.
Yeah.
And that probably took about 6 months to put in place. That is one of the things which I think has to be in place before.
But even then, back then, government had a slightly passive role in the railway. It was arm's length. Now the government could provide an override or an underride to that. It could become the insurer of last resort if. So that's a potential solution.
I'm not saying 100% agree. Yeah. Of course it can be solved, and it doesn't need to take a long time, but it must be solved.
Fair point.
And there's probably 100 other little things like that, because otherwise it genuinely invalidates the rolling stock lease, and that does cause a problem. So I think, not least because for all sorts of reasons. So I think it's just being clear, what are those things that need to be true in order to allow that leading mind to be able to say, look, we've got a problem on the railway today, there's been an incident, this is how we're going to recover from it. But again, that doesn't need to take a long time.
As long as we can have care with pace,
exactly,
and not care with paralysis,
that's right,
then I'll be very happy.
I'm 100%.
Okay. So I suppose that, pulling all that together, really, does that mean that sat here in October 2024, do you feel positive, maybe more positive than you did a year ago? Or, when you walked out of the door of Network Rail and decided you'd made that move, you must have had a sort of a state of mind about how confident you felt about the future. Has that got better since in however many months?
Completely. I mean, I'm personally been re-energized. And it's amazing, so personally I'm re-energized, which is fabulous. I'm loving what we're doing here. I'm loving the fact that I can have a debate around GBR's P&L and how I think there's an answer here that wins. Really enjoy doing that type of work. And I think in the wider context of GBR itself and the legislation, both the initial legislation in Parliament now, and that's to follow, I'm positive. I just think, sadly, this is going to be harder than anyone imagines. I think, all of my respect goes to the people that are leading this right now. Respect because they've taken this mighty challenge on. It was one thing for BR to disaggregate itself, to try and start knotting this together again, literally putting Humpty Dumpty into some sort of recognisable shape, is, I'm afraid, going to be a lot harder than I think many people realise. And unfortunately, it's that alliance experience which proved that to me. That's not what I want it to be, but I think that is the reality. And I think that actually it's right to have that conversation quite explicitly. So we as a railway community are not disappointed when things take longer than we might like.
Well, coming from you, those are words that we would all be wise to listen to. I want to just finish with something that I know is very close to your heart, and that's the Railway Benefit Fund, of which you are chair of the trustees. What inspired you to get involved with that, and what are I suppose it'd be what is it, and what's it trying to deliver, and what are the challenges there?
Okay, so RBF's been around for a long time, over 160 years. Originally had it was awarded a sort of royal charter from Queen Victoria.
Is that right?
We've still got it.
Wow.
And we were getting a cheque every year for about £100 from the late Queen. And of course, it's been written about in railway folklore, if you like. But it's all about railway people, and it's the thing that really what's motivated me. The reason I got involved was because a guy called Richard Goldson, who you might remember, very important in the National Express for many years. Richard Goldson basically asked me if I'd like to, and I took it in the spirit the question was asked. But it was a privilege, and so RBF, spends hundreds of thousands of pounds each year raising money in order to then give grants and support to railway people and their families, both retired railway people, but ever more so, as we've refocused in the last 10 years, to people that work on the railway today. And the thing that when I started, I was wondering, does the RBF even need to exist? The railway industry salaries, as I know when I compare it to my road business, are huge. Railway salaries are, compared to what I see in many other parts of the world that I now live in, are, very
competitive, I think.
Competitive, yes. In a way they weren't at, at time of privatisation, So I wondered whether there was a need. But of course, what I've done just then is reiterate an untruth, because of course the people that are working in the retail units, the people working in the coffee shop, they're every bit as much of the railway family as the signaller, aren't they? And of course, not every signaller is on a huge amount of money. Not every driver's on a huge amount of money. And even if you've got a lot of money, people still have debt. People have difficult lives. They need help. They need counselling and support. And RBF helps with all of those things. So yeah, it's been a really good thing to do over 10 years. I started, as you know, as I said, right on the front line. I've been very lucky to have the career that I've had, but I never forget that things could have been even different, and I might have been the person that was on a train driver salary, but also still with debt or with something I needed some help with.
Brilliant. Well, listen, all the best with that. I know Joe Kay, who's the chief executive, another person who it's very hard to say no to ever. So is really sort of helping lead that as well, and it's a terrific thing, and all power and support to you for that. Tim, I have to say, every time I have a conversation with you, I come away a bit like you feel with this role, energized and inspired and happier with the world. This is exactly the same. I'm sure you're right that it's going to be harder than people would like it to be, but as long as they apply the kind of energy and pace and let's do it tomorrow kind of thing, not in a week's time, that is a chance. Thank you for your time. Wish you all the best with Freightliner, and wish you all the best in playing a very important role in this rail industry to come. So, Tim Shoveller, thank you very much.
Thank you.